My glasses come on with Melanne. Melanne, you are one of the most distinguished women in public policy, and I've admired Melanne for so many years. In fact, when I was thinking about starting a foundation, there was one person that I begged to have a meeting with in Washington, and it was Melanne. Do you remember that meeting?
Oh, I remember it so well, and I'm so pleased to be here today because of all that you've achieved, melding business purpose with the purpose to have social impact and to have all of us embrace our ambitions. So congratulations.
Thank you, and thank you for taking that meeting. I always say, thank you. I always say, just ask, because you could have said no, and you were so gracious and probably pretty busy in DC, but thank you. What is it going to take to get a woman to be president, Melanne?
And to ask that today when we've had the last women out of 5 candidates drop out of the presidential contest. Well, you know, we came awfully close last time, so it can be done. And in fact, Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than the current occupant of the White House.
I actually think that's a good hat, the current occupant of the White House.
And being the great designer that she is, I can imagine you can do amazing things with that. But we have an archaic institution called the Electoral College, and it is what it is. But I think the potential was certainly demonstrated and came very, very close. But 227 years of the history of this country, clearly we need to have had several women in the White House, not still having it elude us. But I think that it will happen. Nobody batted an eye when the candidates announced one after the other for this presidential race. And clearly there are no women standing, but I think we're getting accustomed to the idea that it is time and there's tremendous talent. And what it will take, I think, are large numbers of women in all capacities running for office, from local up through national office. And there will be an extraordinary group who will be ready to take the mantle. And it's possible that there might be a vice presidential female candidate.
That's what I was going to say. Any ideas who?
Well, I think the field is clear, and I think that's another example of the talent that's available. But that could be the way that we really get to where so many of us want to see happen.
I agree. And this is an embarrassing statistic. The U.S. ranks 76 out of 193 countries based on the percentage of women in elected positions. How is that possible, and how do we close that gap?
Well, it's another one of those challenges, but I think the subtext for today is confronting those kinds of stereotypes and norms that have really negatively impacted women. In fact, a study came out today by the UN that it was an index of social norms. And of the 75 countries that are looked at, half of the people basically say that politics isn't for women, that men are the perfect candidates for that office. So we're dealing with something that this whole gathering is really working to address. But I think we should take great heart. In 2018, we've had the women's marches. 35 women were elected to the House. We now have 24%, not 50%, but 24 is better than we were 2 years prior to that. 25% in the Senate. And I think it just goes to show what can happen. If you look at that class of 35 newly electeds, they are a very diverse group. They come from every segment of the population, every kind of background. And many of them ran because they confronted things in their own lives, medical care, or some other major a problem that they saw that needed to be addressed, and they were encouraged, they embraced their ambition, and they decided to run, and they won. So, and women tend to be reelected because they prove themselves to be very good elected officials.
And I mean, women, or anyone needs to be ambitious when running for office, but particularly a woman. What are some of the negative stereotypes that women face, or bias that women face that men just don't face?
Well, you know, the one that really gets to me is, oh, she's ambitious. Now, if a man is ambitious, that is a noble trait. It's a highly valued characteristic. But somehow a woman who's ambitious, and ambitious for good, is viewed somehow as power hungry. She's viewed as, well, why should you be one who aspires to this office? And there's so many others, you know. She should be tough, but if she's too tough, well, she's arrogant. She needs to be likable. Well, what male candidate is ever weighed on likability?
Do you know, some of our entrepreneurs have told me they've Googled how to not look ambitious. And that's a word I have a big history with. I've learned to embrace my ambition, get comfortable with it. Was there a time that you never owned your ambition?
I think I've always been determined, but I've recognized that the environment may not always be hospitable, so I've tried to be non-threatening. You know, even when I was working in the State Department, we were trying to promote women's issues very significantly to deal with mostly male decision makers who were occupying the most important positions. I used to talk to them about how this can make you more effective, so their self-interest. But it was really also about my self-interest because I wanted to see these issues making progress.
A little wordsmithing.
A little wordsmithing. Communications is very important.
And something that I find interesting, there's a lot of conferences. You go to a lot of conferences. I think we all do, and there's a lot of women's conferences.
Yes.
And one thing that I'm determined to do with our team is to bring men in on the conversation around women's equality. How do we, well, I'd love your thoughts on that. How do we ensure that's a given? When I speak to fathers about their daughters, it is a given. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Fathers are very ambitious for their daughters.
Yes.
And I'm often very happily amazed at how often they'll mention, I have a daughter, which means I want to see her achieve all that she can achieve. But I think men are vital to women's progress. After all, they occupy still the most powerful positions. And I think back to that first Equal Rights Convention all of those years ago in our own history, when the men who made the journey with the women for women's equal rights, a third of the people who journeyed were men. And Frederick Douglass was one of them, the great abolitionist. And when he was asked why he was doing it, he said, because I feel ennobled. I have been fighting for my people, clearly, but it's also important to be there for the women. And today, if we look at business or politics or any area, and oftentimes much of the progress has been made because men have been there pushing it. And it's particularly true in business, I think you would agree.
I mean, women think differently than men.
Yes.
There's a reason that women should be at the table.
Diversity is an advantage. And increasingly, the data is there to uphold that in significant ways. So it's looking at the bottom line as well as it being the right thing to do.
So to have men weigh in on the conversation and all of these conferences, we won't be talking to ourselves. We need to have 50% of the population engaged. Melanne, you were the first ever U.S. ambassador to global women's issues. And what do you think is the most pressing issue in terms of women's rights today?
Well, I think it's still gender equality. You know, we're on the cusp of marking the 25th anniversary of a UN conference that took place in China, Beijing, when those words echoed throughout the world. Women's rights are human rights. Women are human. But women's rights were not even chiseled into international human rights law. So that equality journey, that journey to see equal, continues. And I think based on what you're doing here with respect to norms and stereotypes, it's continuing to hold back progress. There's been progress in education and other ways. But in terms of economic participation, economic progress for women, from equal pay to really having a place in boardrooms and management. Women are the majority of graduates today, and yet there's that ceiling. And political power, because that's where so many decisions are made, for good or not.
So then, to that point, we've made progress, because if we're looking at politics today, and you just mentioned the stats on women, they will be in decision-making roles. So the fact we're talking about equal pay in this day and age is upsetting, to say the least. But how do we move the needle there? Because Lilly Ledbetter happened many years ago.
And there's a very prestigious group called the World Economic Forum. They've never been accused of being a women's organization. But they put out an annual gender gap report, and they reported that it will take 200 years at the rate that we're going for equal pay, and 100 years to close the gender gap with men. So we have a long way to go, and I just want to encourage everybody here to follow this great woman's example. Embrace your ambition, do everything you can. I co-authored a book called Fast Forward, and the only reason I did it is because we have to accelerate our progress. And the book is about how each of us, no matter where we sit, no matter what our job, whether it's entry level or CEO, we can understand that we have power, and each of us does, and combine that power with purpose, and we can change the world, and it's time.
And speak up for yourself. I mean, the idea of power and purpose is essential, and women have a voice, and together with men, I think we all have a stronger voice.
We'll get there.
So thank you so much, Melanne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.